The Republican-led U.S. House has passed legislation aimed at ending President Trump's tariffs on Canada. The move signals growing anxiety over the White House economic agenda ahead of midterm elections. Let's bring in our Washington Deputy Bureau Chief Laura Davison. Laura, this legislation needs to be signed by the president anyway. So how much is this about sending a message, basically?
This is right now all about sending a message. Trump is very unlikely to sign this legislation. In fact, he said he would veto it and threatened all the Republicans who voted to pass this. In order to override that veto, you'd need 2/3 majorities in the House and Senate, and that is highly unlikely to come to pass. But what this really signals is a growing rift within the Republican Party as they're headed into an election year. There's a lot of tricky dynamics here of, Republicans have to face voters, and they're worried about these tariffs as voters are increasingly worried about affordability and cost of living issues. But Trump, however, is very angry at the Republicans who joined with Democrats on this vote, and he's threatening to primary them. This is a big deal because, all Republicans before the general election in November, they will have primary races where they will be up against other Republicans. Those are scattered across the spring and into the summer. So if Trump wants to take some of these to task and try to oust them from office before they even get to the general, he could do that.
As a scheduled review of the Canada-U.S.-Mexico Free Trade Agreement draws closer, Prime Minister Mark Carney is beginning to assemble his team to broker a new deal. Carney announced today he's tapped Janice Charette, the former head of the Public Service, to serve as Canada's chief trade negotiator to the United States.
And this just into our newsroom as well. Canada has a new top negotiator to lead the CUSMA negotiations. Her name is Janice Charette, and she'll work with Canada's ambassador to the United States. Again, this is breaking news. We have just heard from the Prime Minister's office, who says in a statement, quote, with 4 decades of experience in public policy and diplomacy, Janice Charette brings extraordinary leadership, expertise, and a deep commitment to advancing Canada's interests. As chief trade negotiator, she will advance Canadian interests and a strengthened trade and investment relationship that benefits workers and industries in both Canada and the United States.
A vote that wasn't supposed to matter ended up revealing more than anyone expected. It didn't change policy. It didn't rewrite trade law. It didn't force the White House to reverse course. But it did something else, something more subtle, and in some ways more important. It exposed a crack. A small one, but a real one. A crack inside the Republican Party, inside Congress, and inside the political coalition that has supported a tariff-heavy approach to Canada. The U.S. House of Representatives held a symbolic vote aimed at ending some of the tariffs imposed on Canadian goods. Symbolic because it didn't have the power to override the executive. Symbolic because it didn't carry the force of law. Symbolic because it was never going to change the tariffs on its own. But symbolic votes can still send signals. And this one did. A handful of Republicans broke ranks and sided with Democrats to pass the resolution. Not enough to change policy, but enough to show that the tariff consensus is not as solid as it once appeared. At the same time, in Ottawa, a different kind of move was unfolding. No speeches, no drama, no headlines screaming about betrayal or rebellion. Just a quiet appointment. Janice Charette, a seasoned public servant named as Canada's chief trade negotiator to the United States. A former clerk of the Privy Council, a former High Commissioner to the United Kingdom. A figure who understands the machinery of government at a level most people never see. Her appointment didn't trend on social media, but it mattered. Because it signaled that Canada is preparing for something big, the 2026 review of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the USMCA. These two events, the symbolic vote in Washington and the strategic appointment in Ottawa, are not isolated. They are early movements in a larger choreography. A choreography that will shape the next decade of North American trade. A choreography that will determine how tariffs are used, how supply chains evolve, and how political leverage is deployed. A choreography that will test whether the continent can maintain a stable economic architecture in a time of rising geopolitical tension. To understand why these moves matter, you have to understand the structure of the USMCA itself. Unlike NAFTA, which was open-ended, the USMCA has a built-in review mechanism. Every 6 years, the three countries must sit down and decide whether to continue the agreement. If they don't agree, the deal begins to move toward expiry after 16 years. That means 2026 isn't just a date. It's a pressure point. A moment when each country can use the threat of uncertainty as leverage. A moment when tariffs, access, and concessions become bargaining chips. This is why the House vote matters, even if it didn't change anything on paper. It showed that the United States is not a monolith. It showed that there are limits to how far some lawmakers are willing to go with tariffs, especially when those tariffs hit allies like Canada. Some Republicans represent districts where manufacturers depend on Canadian inputs. Others represent farmers who rely on Canadian markets. For them, tariffs aren't a symbol of strength. They're a threat to local jobs and local economies. When they break ranks, they're not making a statement about Canada. They're making a statement about the costs of leverage. For Canada, this is useful information. Negotiation is not just about what your counterpart wants, it's about what constraints they face. If Ottawa knows that Congress is uneasy with tariffs, it can adjust its strategy. It can appeal to congressional interests. It can frame its arguments in terms of shared supply chains, shared industries, and shared vulnerabilities. It can remind lawmakers that Canada is not a rival, but a partner in a deeply integrated economic system. This is where Janice Charette's appointment becomes important. She's not a trade lawyer in the narrow sense. She's a system-level operator. Someone who understands how decisions are made inside governments. Someone who knows how to navigate political turbulence. Someone who can read the signals coming from Washington and translate them into strategy. Her background as clerk of the Privy Council means she has coordinated across departments, managed crises, and advised prime ministers. Her experience as High Commissioner to the UK means she has dealt with complex diplomatic environments. She is, in short, the kind of person you appoint when you expect the negotiation to be as political as it is technical. And the USMCA review will be political. The United States is already signaling that tariffs remain on the table. Not because they are the best economic tool, but because they are one of the few tools the executive can deploy quickly and unilaterally. Tariffs create leverage, they create pressure, they create uncertainty. And uncertainty is a powerful bargaining chip. Even after the symbolic House vote, the executive retains the authority to impose tariffs under various legal frameworks. The vote complicates the politics, but it doesn't remove the tool. So why keep tariffs on the table? Because removing them voluntarily would mean giving up leverage for free. As long as tariffs remain a possibility, they can be used to extract concessions. Concessions on dairy, concessions on autos, concessions on market access, concessions on alignment with U.S. policy toward China. Tariffs are not just about economics. They are about shaping the negotiation space. But leverage cuts both ways. Canada is not without options. Over the past decade, it has diversified its trade relationships. It has agreements with the European Union through CETA. It is part of the CPTPP in the Asia-Pacific, and it has deepening economic ties with China. These relationships don't replace the U.S. market, but they give Canada alternatives. They give Canada the ability to say implicitly, if not explicitly, that it cannot be cornered, that it has other pathways, that it can absorb some of the pressure. This doesn't mean Canada wants the USMCA to collapse. Far from it. The United States is still Canada's largest trading partner by a wide margin. The integrated supply chains that run through North America are the backbone of Canadian manufacturing. Losing structured access would be painful. But Canada has hedges. The United States does not have the same degree of diversification. If the USMCA collapses, the U.S. would face disruptions in autos, agriculture, and manufacturing. It would face uncertainty in rules of origin. It would face retaliation. It would face a world where its neighbors deepen ties with other partners, including China. This is why the stakes are so high. The USMCA review is not just a technical exercise. It is a test of whether North America can maintain a stable economic architecture in a time of political volatility. It is a test of whether the United States can balance domestic political incentives with international economic realities. It is a test of whether Canada and Mexico can navigate a negotiation where the United States holds more power, but not unlimited power. The symbolic House vote is an early signal. It tells us that there is some discomfort inside the United States with using tariffs on allies as a routine instrument. It tells us that the coalition behind tariff-heavy policies is not unbreakable. It tells us that the politics of trade are shifting, not dramatically, not decisively, but subtly. And subtle shifts matter in negotiation. Janice Charette's appointment is another signal. It tells us that Canada is preparing for a negotiation that will be complex, political, and high stakes. It tells us that Ottawa wants someone who can navigate Washington's internal dynamics. It tells us that Canada is not approaching the review as a routine check-in, but as a potential inflection point. Together, these signals point to a larger story, a story about leverage, a story about uncertainty, a story about how countries prepare for moments when the rules can change. The USMCA review is one of those moments. It is a moment when the future of North American trade will be shaped. It is a moment when tariffs, appointments, and symbolic votes all become pieces of a larger puzzle. If the USMCA survives the review, North America will have a more stable foundation for the next decade. If it collapses, the consequences will be felt across industries, across borders, and across political systems. The United States would face disruptions in supply chains it depends on. Canada would face painful adjustments, but it would also lean more heavily into its other trade relationships. Mexico would face uncertainty in its manufacturing sector, and the world would see a North America that cannot maintain its own economic architecture. This is the context in which the symbolic vote and the quiet appointment must be understood. They are not the main event. They are the early movements, the tremors before the negotiation, the signals before the storm. And as the review approaches, more signals will come. More votes that don't change the law but change the mood. More appointments that quietly prepare the ground. More rhetoric about fairness, sovereignty, and leverage. More reminders that trade is not just about goods and services. It is about power. It is about relationships. It is about the architecture that holds economies together. The question is not whether the USMCA will be reviewed. It will. The question is not whether the review will be contentious. It will. The question is whether the three countries can navigate the review without destabilizing the system they depend on. That is the challenge. That is the risk. That is the opportunity. And that is the story behind a symbolic vote, a quiet appointment, and a coming trade showdown that will shape the future of North America.